Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a nice autumn evening and for giving up a little bit of the World Series, just a little bit. Anyway, my name is Stora Latronica. I am the director of the Brooks Memorial Library, and I would love to welcome you all to this wonderful program this evening, sponsored by the Vermont Humanities. And as you know, at the beginning of the program, we always like to give a preview of coming attractions. So next month, our first Wednesday lecture will be William Carlos Williams, America's most revolutionary 20th century poet. And this is a lecture delivered by UVM Professor Huck Goodman. So please do mark your calendars. I'm sure you already have them marked for first Wednesdays. Yeah, leave the china at home. Anyway, now we've come to the thank you part of the evening. And for me, when I read a book, I always make sure to read the acknowledgments because there just might be somebody I know there. So you can think of this as the acknowledgments part of the evening, and there might be somebody you know. So first of all, thank you to your friends and mine, the friends of the Brooks Memorial Library that make this evening possible. So let's give them a big hand. So truly, it is the friends that bring us all the wonderful programs for all ages that we enjoy through the library. And if you're one of the lucky people that have been a friend in the past, you'll be getting a special letter from the Friends of the Library in the coming weeks as part of their annual appeal because they're kicking it off now. And so so when you get the letter, be sure and enjoy it and realize how much we value your support to bring these kinds of programs to everybody in the community. Also, for our statewide underwriters, we have the National Life Group Foundation and the Vermont Department of Libraries, of course. The library underwriters, the people that locally that underwrite these programs for Brooks Memorial Libraries include the Brattleboro Camera Club, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs, Rakeland, Martin, PLLC, the Richards Group, and World Learning. So let's thank them. And our program sponsors for this evening are Carol and Jeff Gaddis, Chroma Technology, Crosby Gannett Fund of the Vermont Community Foundation, Merchants Bank, University of Vermont Humanities Center, and Vermont Public Radio. And to show you how much they support, how much VPR supports this program, they sent a very special dignitary to come. So Leslie Blount, who is the VPR Director of Corporate Support, is going to introduce our speaker this evening.
I don't think I've ever been called a special dignitary, so this is a big night. Wow. We at VPR are equally grateful to the Vermont Humanities Council for convening events like this that bring us together to become informed and educated and just look at the world in a new way. And it is our pleasure to partner with the council to help bring well-known public radio journalists to Vermont because frankly, we're as excited to meet them as you are. We're all public radio geeks for sure. So for many of us, tonight's guest is as much a part of our morning routine as our cup of coffee. He brings us up to speed on what's gone on in the world markets while we slept, and explains to us what events in the market and changes in legislation and company mergers all mean in a way that a smart and really intelligent friend might talk to us. David Brancaccio, of course, is the host of American Public Media's Marketplace Report, a regular segment on NPR's Morning Edition. His reporting focuses on the future of the economy, financial and labor markets, technology, the environment, and social enterprises. And some of us have heard David's reporting for many years. You might recall he was Marketplace's European correspondent based in London, and he hosted Marketplace's evening program from 1993 to 2003. Alas, for a few years, he did leave us in public radio for the glamour of public television, and co-hosted the news magazine program Now with the amazing Bill Moyers. He became the program's solo anchor in 2005. He's the author of the book Squandering Aimlessly, an exploration of how Americans apply their personal values to their money, and has created a feature-length documentary film, Fixing the Future. Among his awards for broadcast journalism are the Peabody, the DuPont Columbia, the Cronkite, and yes, an Emmy. David has a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University and a master's in journalism from Stanford. He lives in New Jersey with his wife, Mary Brancaccio, a poet and educator. And he joins us as a fellow Northern New Englander, not afraid of winter, this man. He grew up in Waterville, Maine. In addition to attending schools in Waterville, Maine, he also attended schools in Madagascar, Ghana, and Italy. And if you travel in Maine, you're not sure if that's a country or a city in Maine. So join me in welcoming our smart and interesting friend, David Brancaccio.
Look at this crowd. Thank you for coming out. I thought there'd be like 6 people here. You know, it did just happen again to me. About one of the worst things that ever happened to me in public speaking. Just happened again. I was in Nantucket. It's a venue not unlike this, the Athenaeum. And I was working on my speech. Just before I got up to speak, the gentleman running the program said, "Good luck. Henry David Thoreau and Frederick Douglass were previous speakers in this series." So I was all psyched. I've been working on what I was going to tell you. And just before I got up, one of my new friends here said, "John Kenneth Galbraith spoke at that very podium." And here I am. So I'm not going to spend much time at the podium. I'm not sure I am fully worthy of that. So we'll do a little Phil Donahue action. I'll kind of move around and, this is a bit of a conversation, right? This is to torture Maria, who's doing her best to track the roving host. Special round of applause for Maria. I also want to thank the Vermont Humanities Council. This is social capital that they're putting together here. I'm going to come back to that theme in just a second. Social capital is what this lecture series, I think, is about. I want to thank the Brooks Memorial Library and, of course, my peeps, Vermont Public Radio. I think we're all in the social capital business at some level. Let me tell you about the problem I was hoping to solve with something that I will share with you in a moment. The problem that I was trying to solve with a series we did on the radio, and we'll talk about it here tonight, is that we humans are very good at a lot of things, but we are not good at thinking about the future. We're very good at worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, maybe in a month. But after that, things get very dim very quickly. It rolls off much more quickly than researchers had realized. There's even a fancy pants term for our inability to see much beyond the tips of our shoes. It's called, sorry for the term, hyperbolic discounting. And this is a huge problem for things like personal finance. If you want to buy something now, you get immediate gratification. Talking about retirement decades hence is very difficult. So researchers have looked into this, and they've documented it, but they haven't come up with a cure. I went on a little bit of a quest on radio not too long ago to figure out, well, what's the thinking, at least, in dealing with this? Because it isn't just a personal finance issue, it's a huge public policy issue. It affects everything from infrastructure spending on down. So some researchers talked to me and said, well, one exercise that you might try if you're trying to condition your little brain to start thinking a little bit more about where you want to be in the future is just imagine something in the intermediate future, like maybe you're lucky enough to have the chance of doing a fun vacation next summer, 2017. Turns out, if you spend a few moments reflecting on that thing next summer, your brain is a little bit more open to the notion of, well, I got to save for that trip. Gee, what else am I saving for? I wonder if I should also start thinking about what year was I going to retire again? So that works a little. Another odd suggestion that I was given by a researcher to try to mute the effects of hyperbolic discounting was to interview your future self. So try to put myself in the shoes of a retiree and have this kind of odd, slightly mentally ill dialogue with oneself in which you do both of the voices. That apparently helps. So I picked up on that theme, and I believe I improved it slightly. I was on a business trip to the West Coast, and I made a date with an actual human being who I would like to think is a version of my future self. He's a buddy of mine, Herb is his name, Herb Mayer. He's a serial entrepreneur, started from scratch, picked himself up from nothing, and created 5 businesses, quite well off. And he's 93 now, I think. And I went out there when he was 92, and I interviewed him about some of my personal finance issues as a kind of a surrogate for interviewing myself. It was great. This guy is a child of the Depression, so he doesn't think I should spend money for anything. And I said, Herb, you gotta see my kitchen. Our kitchen is just it's not like we're bougie and we have a perfectly good kitchen that we should just live with. People walk in, and even civilians are crestfallen when they walk in to see our old kitchen. And he said I was not allowed to borrow even a penny to fix this. If I wanted a kitchen, I could save for it when I had the money. Then I could think of improving it. And he said, you could also refinish your appliances. Refinish your appliances? I mean, I've heard of cabinets. And he showed me his fancy refrigerator that had been refinished. So I learned something. But it was wonderful to get a warning from someone who knows his way around money, another reminder about this notion of borrowing for today and not worrying about the effects in the future. Another way that people approach hyperbolic discounting, you may have seen this. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor, don't go look at this. Whatever you do, don't act on what I'm about to tell you. It's one of those things that once you've seen it, you cannot unlearn it. Merrill Lynch has a investment brand called Merrill Edge. And aren't they clever with their little sociology studies that must have led to this? You go on their website, and you can click a button, and you stare into your screen, and it takes a picture of your face, and then there's a slider that ages you through the decades. And I did it. I kept my hair. It looked like a wax effigy of me had been left out overnight on the radiator, and it sort of. Look, we're all beautiful at all ages, but it was a wake-up call, and but this little mini pilgrimage of mine to think about hyperbolic discounting was useful for me personally, I think, because I could talk about, it does prompt the important discussion that we should all be having, which is, when we're older, where do we want to be? And the way pensions are going in this country, a lot of that burden is going to fall on ourselves. And if we're lucky enough, and not everybody is nearly lucky enough, to be able to save some going along, this is probably pretty important. But this problem, this issue of corporations not being able to see past today's stock market results, maybe they can see to the next financial quarter, or a political system that has a whole lot of trouble seeing beyond the next election cycle. What do you do? Well, I got some insight into maybe one approach that I wanted to share with you. I've sometimes been asked, who's the most amazing person I've ever interviewed? And that's tough to answer. One of the great things about being a reporter is you get to meet all these wonderful people who normally would not give me the time of day, but they have to talk to me. And so I get to meet neat people. I got to meet former President Carter. Went down to Atlanta. He pulled a jar out of his pants that had formaldehyde, and in it was a disgusting creature. It was a guinea worm. And it's one of the parasites that the Carter Center has been working to wipe off the face of the earth. Very graphic, the ex-president, about how the guinea worm digs itself out of your skin, and it's like, whoa, Mr. President. I've interviewed Bill Gates over the years. It's interesting, you know, he's always was brilliant, but to see his evolution from techie with a kind of engineer brain to a person who is working hard to leave the world a better place than he found it. It's really fun. But I think numero uno is the person who gave me the idea for what I wanted to speak with you about tonight. I had the honor of doing the last long-form TV interview with Kurt Vonnegut before he passed away. And I don't know, we recorded about 2 hours. We made almost an hour of television out of it. He's probably about 80, 81. He was about 81 when we talked. And he was completely with it. And very seldom does my spouse come in to New York for my interviews, but this one she was going to come in for, and Mr. Vonnegut promptly proposed marriage to her. My wife thought about it seriously. Why not? He was amazing. And I realized as the cameras were rolling that there was an issue that was presenting itself that I had to resolve by the end of the interview. The issue that was emerging as Mr. Vonnegut and I were talking was that the transcript of what he was saying offered a dire assessment of how not only are we going to kill the earth, we've already killed it. It's very downbeat. If you wrote down what he was saying, and looked at the words on the page, you could sort of see it happening in real time. Yet, the person who is before us was full of joie de vivre. That is paradox. So I was like, I gotta work at this, and I'll talk to you in a moment about what I came up with. And I think in the end of the interview, we start to see how those two things live side by side. But in that interview, he says something very quickly that has since become, I wouldn't say it's a full-on, full-bore meme in the digital world, but it has been repeated a decent amount of time. He said, what no country ever had was a secretary of the future, and there are no plans for our children and our grandchildren. That's a good idea, I thought. And I thought about it a lot in the years since. It almost got buried because of some of the other wild parts of that interview. At one point, we're on, a TV set, and he says, I've got a little statement here, and you wouldn't mind if I read it, would you? I said, go ahead, sir. He pulls out a manifesto, and he looks into the camera like Howard Beale on the movie Network, the crazy anchorman. And he looks into the camera and accuses President Bush of essentially war crimes. He throws the phrase oral sex into the middle of that. We ran it because it was in context about something important. And then about 20 minutes later in the interview, he says, well, I have this other statement. I'm like, oh no. And he looks into the camera with that statement, and he reads the Beatitudes from the Bible. It's a great moment. We included that too in the interview. So I almost lost the thread of this Secretary of the Future idea. But as this campaign was gearing up, not since the conventions, but early on, from the spring, I knew how ugly it was going to get. I didn't think it was going to be this ugly. Lord knows, I didn't think it was going to be this ugly. But I thought it would be a tenth as ugly. And I thought, in addition to whatever coverage we're doing, is there a way to kind of lift us up a little bit and think more broadly about actual issues? Heaven forbid, issues in a campaign. So we resurrected this notion of, what about a Secretary of the Future? Maybe if we push the candidates, maybe someday we might get one. Someone at the cabinet level to think longer term about the effects of policy on the next generation, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And if we did have a Secretary of the Future, what would that person's portfolio be? We thought we could seed the conversation, fertilize the conversation. I got our reporters doing feature stories about some logical ones to explore. And then we turned to the audience. And it's been a wonderful process. It's been really eye-opening for me. One of the things we found out early on is that this isn't such a wacky idea. It turns out that some enlightened corporations have secretaries of the future. They don't call them secretaries of the future, they call them CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers. Sometimes that is greenwashing. In other words, a public relations ploy to make you think that the company cares. That could be. Sometimes it's quite focused on something that is vast in its importance, which is carbon footprint, very specifically climate change. A lot of companies, a number of companies have a chief sustainability officer that focuses on that. But at some companies, I found this even more interesting, the CSOs, the Secretaries of the Future, are thinking holistically about, are we doing stuff that comes back to haunt the organization? Are we doing stuff that wrecks the communities that we're in? And that's a really interesting conversation. Turns out, and this is maybe a little scary to contemplate, but I will share it with you. It turns out that some big philanthropic money has been invested in essentially institutes in a number of places around the world, from Cambridge, England to Berkeley, California. I counted about 6 of these, and it was not an exhaustive list. Institutes, essentially Secretary of the Future institutes. They're institutes for the study, the one in Cambridge, England, is for the study of existential threats. It's often money from high-tech tycoons who are worried about the dangerous, if not fatal, effects of their own technology. You know, what if, I don't know what if, but your mind can go wild. What if what if experiments in biotechnology suddenly turned all life on Earth into slime mold overnight or something like that? They worry about that stuff. They worry very much about artificial intelligence run amok. These are the people who kind of know about this stuff. P.S. I was sitting next to a prominent artificial intelligence researcher the other day in Chicago. Chicago Ideas Week is this fun thing that they do. Bring lots of people from around the world together to talk about ideas, not a bad idea. And I said, hey, Mr. AI robot researcher guy, what are you worried about? Give me something. Oh, I don't worry about everything. It's all under control. And his field of work is making empathetic robots, cute little, like little doggy ones that humans want to trust just a little bit more, which maybe is a little scary. I go, come on, give me something. So he had this second glass of wine. This is how reporters do their work, by the way. Yeah. He said, you know what I worry about when I lie there at night? I go, what do you worry about? He goes, I worry about an artificial intelligence playing the long game. I go, what do you mean? He said, you know, artificial intelligence, they don't care about time. They get all the time in the world. If an AI wanted to kill you, it could ever so slightly poison you over a 15-year period. Or It could ever so slightly drive you crazy till you jumped off of a building. And I thought that was just fiendish. And something else to worry about in 2016. But the Secretary of the Future thing, so I asked my reporters to look into some cool stuff to get the discussion going. One of my reporters came back with the future of the bathroom. Some of it, of course, the bathrooms are public policy this year, you know, how you label them. But you know, there's got to be a better way. Actually, my favorite better way was in Europe, and then San Francisco imported the technology. Didn't work that well. You remember the story? There were these big public restrooms, circular, and you put in Europe, you put in a euro coin. Here, you know, I think a quarter, and you got a deal. And the door opened, and you went in, and then when you left, the door closed, and these hot jets squirted everything all over the porcelain, and it was pristine when the next person came in, except you know what went wrong, right? Cheapskates would hold the door open for the next person or their friend. The door would close, it would lock, and then everybody would get a shower. See, that's why you need a Secretary of the Future to be thinking of these things. The future of the Department of Motor Vehicles. I mean, you know, in a world where we're going to get all these driverless cars, we gotta figure out a better way. Maybe here in Vermont it's perfect and it's like, you know, it's like Disney World, right? I assume, but not in New Jersey, not in California, not in DC, some of the places I've lived. But on the subject of the autonomous vehicle, forget about the DMV, that's small potatoes. You know, I asked my audience, what are some of the things the Secretary of the Future should worry about? And an architect, a young architect from Chicago, contacted us, and I put him on the air the other day. And he said, we need a Secretary of the Future to worry about autonomous vehicles. I go, why? Sounds like there's a lot of investment in that area. Private industry, partnered with government, is working quite diligently on this problem. He said, not on some of the most important ramifications of the driverless car. On the plus side, for instance, what if we someday live in a world where little pod vehicles, autonomously operated by little robots, come to fetch us in the cities at the end of the day? That would free up parking space. What will we do with the parking space? Would it be green space? Would it be extra drainage? What would it be? No one's thinking about that. That's on the positive opportunity side of the ledger. On the challenge part of the ledger, what if robot cars means the suburbs spread further out? What if you're willing to drive 2.5 hours into work because you're watching Netflix, playing Facebook, and you know, generally having a good time, or potentially doing some work? Well, someone should be thinking about what the policy implications of that are. So this is where the Secretary of the Future idea really started to, I think, gel. We had Amy Scott, our education reporter, did a very interesting piece about the future of learning. There's some interesting thinking going on now about maybe we should get some sort of formal credit for all the learning that we do. On the job course that you take, an online course that isn't so official, you go to an open university style night class, you read a few books. What a concept. Shouldn't that count? How do you adjudicate that? How do you keep people from gaming that kind of system? I have a son who's a successful software engineer in the Silicon Valley. He went to art school. He knows all about 3D, and he's doing 3D work. But the training in the coding part of what he does was just up the road here in the town of Ashwelot, New Hampshire, after college. I don't think he actually articulated the idea that he wanted to be thorough, but he moved into the woods of New Hampshire for 1.5 years after college, like a hermit. The reason I know Brattleboro is we want to go eat somewhere when we come see him. And taught himself coding. And it has counted for his career, but it doesn't count in any formal way. Why shouldn't it count in some formal way? Really interesting notion. Future of food security, water security. Future of hospitals. Hospitals may look a whole lot like your house because maybe you don't go to a hospital. Maybe the technology or the assistance that you need comes to you in a much more intensive, sustained way than it does now. Future of currency. Oh my God, right? With Bitcoin and this whole blockchain thing that I don't think I can explain. I don't think I fully understand it. Blockchain is a way that a transaction is recorded. It can only go in one direction, so it's a little bit harder to commit fraud. And so I read this dense piece in Business Week about blockchain. I was like, all right, I can do this. David, you can do this. I might have to be signing stories or myself reporting on this. Read the blockchain piece. And there was a whole company set up to show how awesome blockchain is. This way of encoding in one direction financial transactions so that there's always this trace and you can't game it or manipulate it or commit fraud. And so this company, this sort of test company, gets started, and the article is very excited by this technology. This is going to change everything. Except if you read down to like the 25th, word number 25,000 in the piece, turns out somebody hacked that company and stole money. So other than the fact that, you know, we have also taken the Secretary of the Future idea, and I hope in a few minutes, when we switch over to Q&A, we could sort of continue this here. I'd love to hear your views on this. I recently was in Kurt Vonnegut's hometown. I went to Indianapolis. We went to the high school he attended, Shortridge High, and we got a room like this, and we brought in people, and I asked them for suggestions for Secretary of the Future. And we got some really interesting ones, which I will share with you in just a sec. And then something wonderful, but completely unexpected for me happened. Thought I kind of knew the direction it would go, and something really neat happened I want to share with you. So some of the ideas that people suggested, there was a guy who's an entrepreneur, high-tech entrepreneur, has done well, and he opened it by saying something about, I'm very much an enlightened capitalist, I am not a socialist. And I was like, well, what's the thing he's going to suggest? He said, given the rapid changes in technology and how machines will soon be able to do just about everything that humans do, what are we going to do? What job are we going to have? So he suggested a universal basic income. Yeah, I know. And so how far-fetched is this? The Swiss voted on it in the last year. They turned it down, but it was a serious public policy issue. I don't know how it works in this country. I haven't figured that out. But we got to figure out something, because I realize it's the AAA threat. Can I do all three A's? Algorithms, no, I have to write it down. Automation, artificial intelligence, algorithms are doing almost everything. About 4.5 years ago, you may have heard this on the radio, I did a series about some of this called Robots Ate My Job. And at the time, there were these two wonderful MIT economists who were saying, look, since economics was invented as a discipline, technology has always been disruptive. Loads of people have lost their jobs, but on net, many more jobs were created, and those jobs were better. 98%, typical economists will tell you this, 98% of agricultural jobs in America were destroyed by farm equipment. 98% of those jobs disappeared, but people, in theory, got better jobs. I don't know, working in a disgusting factory, but productivity went up, they were paid more, and standards of living rose. Now may be different, these MIT economists told me almost 5 years ago. And we had other mainstream economists writing me saying, you're an idiot, you didn't study economics, you studied history, that's why you're so stupid, David. Well, guess what? Those two MIT guys were just the leading edge of a very important discussion that we're having about what we call technological unemployment. If you pick up Forbes magazine, no, you don't pick it up in this case. You go online to Forbes magazine, and there's company profit reports sometimes published in there. And if you take a look at who wrote it, it'll say narrative sciences. It's not a person, it's an artificial intelligence. It's crappy copy, it's not like elegant copy that I would write. I wouldn't do that story. because it's too out of context. But nonetheless, there is AI at the Tampa Tribune, I think it's called, that for 10 years has been taking police blotter stories from the police computers and publishing them in the paper. The guy who created the thing has long since gone on to other things, and people at the paper sort of forgot it was still happening. And this machine has just been trudging along, doing journalism. So, my job is not protected. One time somebody said that they called their insurance company and said it was me who was the automated phone tree at United Health, whatever it was. And they said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "It wasn't me. Why would I do that?" They said, "No, it sounds just like you." So I called when we were recording, and it didn't sound anything like me. It sounded exactly like the person who says, "Support for NPR is brought to you from," it's that voice. So and if you've heard Alexa, the Amazon thing that stays in your living room and listens to everything that you say. And if you say, "Yeah, so I was doing this lecture about Secretary of the Future, and I wondered what the weather was." The weather in Brattleboro. It's pretty intense, this thing. But that voice sounds fantastic if you've listened to one live. It's very real, and that could do me in another second. So this is a threat at all levels. Imagine the pathologist, the person who gets all that medical training to be able to look at slides and take a look at what those cells are doing. There's software that's getting there. It didn't have to pay and get all that student debt. So what are we going to do? Nobody's worried about that. There is nobody, because we got a lot of, one of the presidential candidates I asked about this, the late, great Carly Fiorina. She thought this was the dumbest idea ever, and she's like, "We don't need more government," and she just wasn't at all amused by any of this. But, I mean, if you turn the question, okay, let's just leave this notion of Kurt Vonnegut, Secretary of the Future, off to the side for a moment. What are we going to do when so many of the jobs are taken over by machines? How are we going to guarantee standards of living? So that was one of the suggestions from the audience that night, was a minimum universal income. We also had somebody who said, how about a Secretary of the Future who thinks about public policy innovations? Like what? Like maybe registering everybody at birth to vote. Interesting idea, I thought. What else did people suggest? There was a nice people worried about climate change. A very grumpy gentleman, very intense, but he really had an interesting point. He said the Secretary of the Future we already have secretaries of the future. They're us, the public in a democracy. But what's broken down is once the person gets elected, there's no feedback mechanism. Could a Secretary of the Future come up with a way that there's more constant sort of plebiscites, in a sense, feeding information about people's views on stuff to their representatives? What that person didn't say that night occurred to me late at night the next night. I woke up. What that means is a robot could be your elected official, which I'll leave that to the science fiction people. That's very complicated. And could it be hacked by Russians? Oh, but the FBI says it's not probably Russians. Did anybody understand that today? That article? That the Russians are just trying to disrupt democracy, is what the New York Times sources were telling it. Not get any particular candidate elected. I sat there this morning, read it about 3 times. Okay, but here's the really interesting, unexpected thing that happened that night in Indianapolis. I hadn't thought of this at all. Half of the responses, I would say, from the audience, what should a Secretary of the Future do? They didn't share issues. They were aware that things change and that there'll be new challenges all the time that cannot be foreseen. They wanted to set the basic values of a Secretary of the Future. So a person said, compassion, being uncomfortable with poverty, homelessness, people who don't get their fair share of resources. That should be what a Secretary of the Future thinks about. Could a Secretary of the Future promote the value of critical thinking? Maybe that's like the meta thing that a Secretary of the Future has to worry about. Promoting critical thinking, that would have to be through education and so forth. Another value suggested, the dignity of the individual. If you work hard, shouldn't there be dignity in a job well done instead of people trying to kind of squash you with improvements to with productivity? Ability to emphasize. Could a Secretary of the Future think about how policy could encourage all of us to see our lives, see our own selves through the eyes of others, and see things in a different way through seeing through other people's eyes. And I thought that was just really, really interesting. And by the way, there was also a person who says, we've got to figure out how to get to the next planet. That particular presentation was about a minute after Elon Musk had talked about his plan to get us to Mars. Did you see he set a number on how much it will cost, he thinks? He thinks we can do it in about 20 years. He wants to charge about the median cost of a house. So now that's $280,000 in America. That's chunk. It's the most expensive thing you'll ever buy is your house. But he thinks there'll be enough people that would want to go to Mars. And a person in the audience said, look, out there right now is an asteroid with our name on it, and we don't have any other plans. All our eggs are in this one basket. And I didn't want to be unpopular with that one person in the audience, but I reminded him of what I had said that morning on the radio, because we're doing the Elon Musk story. And Elon Musk's rhetoric was couched this way. He was saying, we only have two choices. One, we can just sit here and wait for the eventual extinction event, or we can become a multi-planetary species. You notice how the rhetoric hems you into the binary. And I had said gently, I'm an anchor man, I'm not a commentator, but every once in a while I can slightly reach. And I said, I can think of a third option, which is staying here and not screwing it up. Right. And so that is also an option. And you know, science fiction has thought about this. When I went across the country to explore the robots ate my job thing, I tried to drive from coast to coast by myself and in this modern world never interact with another human. You kind of do that. There are hotels that there's a robot that checks you in. It's a kiosk. It's certainly easy pass. You don't need any toll takers. You can swipe your vegetables out at self-checkout. And on that trip, I listened to robot radio. I listened to Pandora. This DJ's a robot. And I listened to a book on tape. And it was one of the robot trilogy that Isaac Asimov wrote. The one with like sunshine or sunset or something in the title, I'm forgetting it tonight, but it's the one where the 1%, he wrote this in the 1950s, where the 1% sets itself up on a pristine planet and leaves the mess to the rest of us where we have to toil. I mean, it's kind of what's being discussed, in a sense. By the way, on that coast-to-coast journey of mine to never interact with a flesh and blood, I only screwed up twice. I never did transact business with another human. I got from the beach at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, to Ocean Beach in San Francisco over 6 days, and never dealt with, never handed money to another person, but there were two humans who loomed into the frame. One of them was the woman at a ShopRite in Roanoke who runs the self-checkout facility, and she saw us having trouble scanning an ear of corn. And she was like running at me, and I was running away, and it's all on film. And then I schlepped into Albuquerque at midnight. You know, there's a lot of days of driving and long days. And I was a little cranky because I was passing through Memphis earlier in the day, and I couldn't go to get great barbecue because you have to give money to a real human to get barbecue. I had scanned some frozen pizza and cooked it on my engine block. It thaws, but all it does is thaw out. It's a little floppy, and so I was a little cranky. And I get into Albuquerque at midnight, and the little robot kiosk thing worked, and I was just want to go up to the room and crash. And the night manager, his name was Oz, the Wizard of Oz, had seen my name in the computer and recognized me from radio and just wanted to meet me. I'm sorry I'm not speaking to the little people today. Of course I talked to him, you know, he's a really cool guy, Oz. And I averted a mistake in Vegas. By the way, if you want to have fun in Vegas and never deal with any people, there is the size of an aircraft hangar, a penny arcade museum. And you can change your $20 bill into a whole bunch of quarters and just go crazy in with these pinball machines, which I did, because I was getting stir crazy. But I averted a problem because they'd just taken out the robot at the hotel in Las Vegas, but I figured that out ahead of time, found an alternate. However, I used to live in San Francisco. I used to be on KQED, the station there, for years. I know San Francisco very well. And I realized as I approached the Bay Bridge, wait a minute, the East Coast Easy Pass, is that going to work at the toll plaza? So I pull over, the answer is no. So that would have been 25 minutes from my goal. After 6 days of driving, I was going to have to hand, $2 over to a human. So I ran it. There's video of that. They never caught up with me, actually. Of course, they are going to now. So someone said, well, that's cheating. It's like you robbed the food that you had, and I admit that that is the case. But it was an interesting notion, and I think we're going to revisit the series. The 5-year anniversary of the series is March, April of this year. And I'm working on it now. Maybe you'll have some suggestions for it here now. My current idea, because we've been focused on the election, and none of us are having any luck thinking beyond that. But my current idea is the following, 5 years later, is to find 5 jobs that are robot-proof. Because people are asking me all the time, what should I pay money to get educated in, or what should my kids do, or what is robot-resistant? And there's some high-touch jobs, there's some creative jobs. You have to find out what those are. McKinsey's done a study that'll be very helpful in this area. And I'll go to 5 places and explore those things, but what am I going to do for the narrative arc, the one before I tried to do it without meeting any humans? And the current idea is this. Last time I did it, my only companion was this goofy toy, a robot dog that just kind of sat there and barked and attracted attention. The AI guy with the long game, that person, I said, is there a companion robot? An attractive companion robot? 6 long days on the road. He thought about it, and he said, no. But he said there are 5 different robots that have have individual attributes that would add up to a companion. And I thought that's fantastic, so he's going to set me up if he can. And I'm going to get, there's one that's a conversational AI, so that'll be cool. There's one that touches you, he said. It has this claw that reaches over and does this for 3,000 miles. I don't know, I'm working on that, but maybe you have some better suggestions for that. People thought, by the way, people have been very reflective in this series. The people who listened on the air, people that night in Indianapolis that talked about, the end of the fossil fuel era. And we have this, as Vonnegut put it, everything that he said is razzmatazz about our society has been fueled by fossil fuel. And what do we do when we have to move to the next phase? One country, it turns out, we learned, has a Secretary of the Future. You're going to guess which country. Which country has a Secretary of the Future? Yes, Sweden, of course. That was just a shot in the dark, right? It's always Sweden or Denmark. Or if you're a fellow Scandi here, I'll say Norway and Finland too, just so you're not mad at me. But yes, Sweden. They don't call her a Secretary of the Future. She's strategic planning or something. So we called Christina Persson and talked to her about this. And she said, she talked in a serious way about this. But then she said, I hope your country does get a Secretary of the Future. Why? Because I'm very lonely. I'm the only one, and I want to be able to call somebody. Any questions? Questions about Secretary of the Future, about the work that I do? There's a mic going around. Do me a favor on these questions. Say your name before you ask the question. Anybody? Show of hands. Yeah.
My name is Daniel, and one of the questions I have at the moment, I think in particular this election shows the dominance of reactive thinking. Certainly both the candidates, but one in particular, everything is wrong. And so with the Secretary of the Future, what about not worrying about these things? What about thinking of the things to accomplish, establishing the generative orientation over a reactive responsive?
Yeah, if you think about it, like what if, I wasn't smart enough to frame what I was doing in the lovely way that you have just suggested. But where I got close in our thinking was, let's look at opportunities, because that's all you kind of have. You could just, as my grandmother would say, kvetch, or you could say, what are some interesting ideas moving forward? Here's one that will make you very uncomfortable. It is the story I have not been able to do on the air because it makes people so uncomfortable. When I was doing that documentary film about interesting new ideas for local economies, fixing the future, I suggested this at an editorial meeting, and I was shunned by my colleagues. There's a think tank in Britain that's been thinking a lot about this. You know what solves unemployment? Solves it. The 19-hour work week. 2 people to do each job. Now in America, it's especially difficult because there's no companies that want to pay benefits twice for the same amount of work. What about money? Well, yes, you get paid half, but prices would sink, right? Demand is demand. If you want to sell a car, it would have to be cheaper. Everything would have to get cheaper. There's a fundamental flaw with this. I will get to that in just a second. But what's most interesting, if you think about, sir, your notion of not just sitting around talking about what a mess everything is, but what are the opportunities? What would you do with the time that would be freed up? You could care for a sick relative. You could be volunteering in schools, radically, changing the education picture. You could be doing creative work. It's just wonderful to think about what we would do. The problem is, of course, what if it's just you're going to stare at your phone for another 27 hours a day? That's not a good thing. Or watch 8,000 channels of cable. What's the problem? So far, I haven't licked any of the problems with this, but one that does stand out that the think tank in Britain did not highlight, which is if you're a wage earner, yes, prices would sink, and at first it would be jarring for the society, but if a fancy new car costs 10 grand and you're paid half, that's okay, except if you're living off your wealth, everything suddenly got half as much for them, and they'd be laughing so hard at this concept. That would exacerbate radically income inequality. So there are issues. But it's just one of those interesting notions of if 2 people did the work of one, that would put people to work, but also what do we do with the extra? It's just a really fun discussion. Other questions? Yeah, here comes the mic. Oh, it's one up here. Sir, tell me your name.
Yeah, Stu Kobans, you're talking in a way as if work is something we don't want to do. And what if you enjoy your work more or as much as you enjoy other things?
No, that's an interesting point, right? And I love what I do. And I often think that if I won the lottery, that book Squandering Aimlessly was about what if you were visited by a windfall. And lottery winners are notorious for screwing that up. There's a sociological reason for that. But I often think if I struck it rich, I would like to keep doing what I do. But you know what? I would probably like to do it at a slightly reduced rate because I want to make a bunch of films too. And I'd like to be on the radio enough so you didn't forget me. But if you're, all the creative people in this audience, you're driven to do what you do. You don't want to do half of it. But so that is an issue. And it's true, work is not all drudgery, although it can be. And there's a lot of us that, of course, do what we love to do, but then we have the day job. The day job is probably more of what these people are talking about, that might be divided it may be impractical. Any questions over on the side? Yes, there's a question here. Sir, your name?
Ishaq Shaul. The idea of having a secretary for the future for every country is absolutely great, necessary, and badly needed. But we also need a secretary of planning for the future, for the globe, for the whole world. Because much of our problem issues are global or will be global soon. Population growth, employment, unemployment, migration, all the problems that you have. Who is going to be planning? Who is going to be the secretary of the future for the globe?
Yeah, it's indeed probably a mistake to think about this from a national point of view. I was talking to a UN ambassador the other day from one of the Nordic countries, and they're getting a new Secretary General, and I wasn't smart enough, it was someone else at the table asked, is that person strong-willed enough, the new Secretary General, to bring about significant change to some of the problems that we worry about in the world? And the ambassador said, yeah, the question with that position always is, are you getting a secretary or are you getting a general? I hadn't heard that before. And the idea is if you have someone, and this person, I think the idea is that person would have some, that it takes a forceful personality. Sometimes people in that position have not had that. All this stuff is global. If you want to like the thing I worry a lot about is problems with the financial markets. Supposedly, financial crisis happens every 7 years. Well, let's see. When do you want to start the last one? March of 08 with Bear Stearns? 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, we're overdue. It's just a rule of thumb. It's not every 7 years, but it's not like we've ruled out financial crises. This cannot be anything that just Washington deals with or just Wall Street deals with. It is a global problem. All the migration stuff. I think you're absolutely right. Yes, hi. Tell me your name.
Hi, I'm Dennis, and thank you for being here. I have a question. The algorithms, the AAA, Brett, I don't understand how algorithms, how are they affecting the jobs? And
Yeah, it's I mean, I'm just using it because it began with A, but that's a shorthand, I think, for software that systematizes some kind of system that human beings used to have to puzzle out. And they're coming up with awesome algorithms that do all this decision making. And humans become less relevant. They're always faster. They always remind me of something George Soros said to me on television one time. That guy is interesting. He does not suffer fools lightly, and he doesn't suffer me lightly. But he has a sense of humor. In 1991 or 2, I forget the year, I was Marketplace's London correspondent, and we were barely making it. The pound cost $2.05 to buy one, and I was getting paid in dollars, and it was miserable. We had a little kid. And George Soros single-handedly attacked the British pound in this exchange rate mechanism that the Europeans had put together ahead of the formation of the euro. And he won, the pound lost, the pound sank 30% overnight, and I got a 30% raise overnight. So I thanked him for this, George Soros. I appreciate the raise, and he laughed, thank goodness. But in this interview, he said, I asked him, I said, but he had the view at the time that you had to be very focused on social issues. He's given a lot of money toward bringing the former Eastern Union Bloc countries, nurturing democracy, and he's worried about a lot of other things. But that in terms of his decisions in the market, that's something separate. And I said, but isn't that amoral? And he said, excuse me? I said, amoral. He goes, oh, good, because I thought you said immoral. And he agreed that it was amoral. And artificial intelligences with their algorithms are, unless you spend a lot of time thinking about the ethics of these things, which I'm not sure some of our programmers are doing, there is added dangers. You've thought about this, I'm sure. I lay awake at night about this. Driverless cars are going to have to decide if they run over the kid or preserve the occupant. And they'll have to decide if they hit the deer or save the occupant. Maybe that's easier for some people to answer. This expert told me that Mercedes-Benz has already decided, and the idea is going to protect the occupant. Thank you, the German makers of that car. God bless them. You know what was suggested, and I don't have developed thoughts on the following. I think I'm going to give a lecture about business ethics next spring in Maine, my home state, and I may use this as a central metaphor. He suggested a dial that you choose. Well, and all the other ethical things. There's already a dial in my car, not for killing wildlife. There's a dial in my car, a switch that says, do you want to drive like it's an awesome sports car, environment be damned, or do you want to drive like a prudent person to get maximum miles per gallon? And I can flip it at will and decide if I'm a horrible human or a better human. I do ride a lot of bikes, so if you're going to complain about that, I try at that level. But yeah, algorithms, humans are still very good at a lot of things, and we don't know how the brain works. Any job that has a rote capacity to it, where there's something repetitive, ferreting out info from lots of text, something that you move things from column A to column B. That's where the algorithms are going to rule supreme. Yeah, there's a question over here, and then we'll get back there.
My name is Wendy, and I'm wondering if you found AI dealing with the care and education of infants and young children, or at what point it was suggested that happened.
Like robot and the AIs doing that?
Speaking as a preschool teacher.
Yeah, you know, well, let me answer that in two parts. Have you already figured out that I have no expertise and I'm willing to talk to any issue? Caveat. I'm descended from many generations of teachers. My mom was a junior high teacher, can you imagine? And remember junior high, that's where they don't know how to shower yet? My dad taught, was a college professor, still is actually. And my grandmother taught in a yeshiva and so forth. If people have a specific hunger to learn something, a lot of the technologically aided instruction systems are really good. If you're hungry to learn something specific, you don't need much guidance other than what a machine could give you. But for most actual kids, in the experience of, for instance, my spouse, who is a wonderful high school English teacher, really good at what she does, just a genius at it, so much of that is being a kind of ethical mentor for the kid. It's also having a sixth sense for, is there a problem? Like a problem that's not being stated. It's the highest level of human interactions. And that's going to take an awfully long time for that to be, you know, automated with whatever version of a film strip they come up with for teachers. But the other piece of your question brings to mind the following. Japanese researchers have been working for many years very hard on humanoid robots, you know, robots that look like people. And the reason is the aging population, they don't have enough caregivers. They're trying to get robots that will hang out with older people. And you think, well, that's somehow wrong. But if you could keep a person in their home longer, maybe a robot is better than a person having to switch to an assisted living facility. I mean, I'm not answering that question. I'm just posing that as an issue. There's a Frank Langella movie in which he sort of bonds with a robot. It's a very interesting, prescient film. By the way, it's set in the near future. That film came out about 3 years ago. And the futuristic car that they use in that is an Audi A7, which is the car I use to drive across in my robots journey that a car magazine lent to me. But, and by the way, one of the things with humanoid robots, does anyone here know what the uncanny valley is? You know what that idea is? Once I tell it to you, you should look it up. It's so cool. The uncanny valley, I don't know what the derivation is. If you make a robot or a mannequin too lifelike. It crosses a threshold, and human beings get super creeped out. There's a film called Polar Express with Tom Hanks' voice in it. They went too far.
Yeah.
And kids were like, ran away screaming. And there are some of these caregiver robots, and you could foresee them as teacher robots, that look super real. And they're friendly enough, and they just make your flesh crawl. And so what that AI researcher I spoke to the other day, the one with the long game, they're making the robots either like little pets or like little tiny children, but not too real. Because it's there's a wine store where you buy wine and spirits in New Jersey that's got a full-size bronze statue of like some Kentucky colonel who makes bourbon sitting on a bench out front. And every single time, because I'm a drunk and I go in very often. No, every once in a while I go get some wine. And it freaks you out. And you look and you're like, no, it's not a real figure. There's a special thing that we have that guards against that. And the technologists are going to have to deal with it. But they're working on it. They're trying. And as computer power gets more amazing, they'll be able to do more. Here comes a question on this side. Tell us your name.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Liz McLaughlin.
Hi, Liz.
First a comment, I think there are a lot of people who job share and they're mothers with young children. But also, Thomas L. Friedman had an article in the Times this week who mentioned something similar to what you're talking about, that, well, actually that Donald Trump was mistaken when he was talking about Mexicans and trade deals being responsible for job loss, because most of them were lost through technology and microchips. But I think that's something that's missing in the conversation is retraining, that people, if they lose their jobs or want to work less, they might want to learn something else or have another job.
So glad that you raised this issue. The promise of freer trade was we would retrain people, and we don't in any serious way. In the early 90s, I can't quite remember who it was, because I can't find the interview. I was looking for the archive. It might have been former commerce, a Reagan-era commerce secretary, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, who was preaching the virtues of freer trade ahead of NAFTA. And I said, well, what about, you can't do this if you're not going to retrain, so you have to dedicate lots of money for it. And I said, that doesn't sound like a Republican platform. And he said, well, we have to come to grips with this. And I said, some people can't be retrained. There are shoe workers in central Maine, where I'm from, who are 62 and are just not ready for that. They didn't get the education they may have needed earlier, or maybe they are retrained, but they are not persuaded for whatever reason within themselves. What do you do? And he said, you have to give them money. And did we? We did not. I'm glad you brought this up, though, about we talk about the problems of free trade, and there's an interesting argument that NAFTA isn't the big problem. The problem was letting China enter the WTO in the year 2000, where that was almost willy-nilly. And if you look at some of the big job shifts, a lot of them draw a line to China entering the WTO, not so much NAFTA. But I noticed this summer, we did a series, that global trade is kind of stalled. It was supposed to come back after the financial crisis. Kind of hasn't. It is not growing anymore along with global GDP. Could it be cyclical? We're having in the global south, where commodities aren't as in demand because China is changing its approach to growth. The mess in Europe right now, maybe it'll come back. Some think it's done, that most of the places, I would argue that there's a lot of room for growth in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a place I've spent some time, and I want to raise standards of living there. But no less than Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, came in to talk about this. You know, he's like, I'm too busy, I can't do an interview. And I said, how about peak trade? He said, I'll be right over. And he said, yeah, we don't have all the data to know if it's happened. I said, but let's say it has happened. Does that solve the problem, that we won't see this job drain, this offshoring anymore? He said, oh no. That's already happened. Those are gone. Now, that doesn't mean that at some level manufacturing can get rekindled here and there, but I went to this factory that employed thousands of people. It was the Ingersoll Rand Industrial Tool Company in Rockford, Illinois. I went with BBC Television a couple years ago. It's a vast facility, all closed down, big metaphor for deindustrialization in America. Well, some wonderful guy, an Italian guy, an immigrant, opened it back up and employed hundreds, not thousands, of American workers, because the technology means that you don't need that many people. The big story, I think, is the technology part of this. And we have this perception that it's always good. Or we have learned in economics class that the disruption that you see always generates benefits for society. And the question that people a lot smarter than me are asking is, we're not sure anymore. It also could be a phase. It could be this thunder of technology right now and it quiets back down. It's another. Any other one? And then we'll let you get back to the World Series.
Hi, my name is Gabi. I feel like when we talk about the future, we're talking about children and the future of children, but I'm curious about if you've actually talked to any young people or children about what they want for their future and how we can incorporate young people, teenagers, into the democratic process to actually have a voice about what they want their future to be, as opposed to this kind of theoretical child that we're always trying to make the world better for.
Yeah, this is sort of patronizing this, isn't it? No, that's a great idea. The answer is we haven't done that yet, because we haven't figured out how to get younger people listening to public radio. Although, no, seriously, it's something we've been working on for a long time. You know what happens? And I'm going to get back to your serious point, but what happens is people at age 27 start listening to public radio. When they realize what a mortgage is, or they're starting to have a family, they start listening because they know it's the serious stuff, the policy stuff, the stuff that matters. But with one prerequisite, they do not start to listen at 27 unless their parents have forced them in a car seat, buckled in, force-fed them us when they were little, and they come back. We have made some strides with one of the podcasts that American Public Media, Minnesota Public Radio does, in which young kids pose scientific questions and real scientists answer the questions. It's a great podcast. It has brain in the title. I cannot remember it right now. What is it?
Brains on.
Brains on. Thank you. But absolutely, right? It's like American foreign policy, the USAID going to sub-Saharan Africa and saying, here's how you're going to solve your problems. We've got to talk to some children. I think that's got to be the next step. So I will.
Kip is my name.
Hi, Kim.
I noticed we were talking about jobs, the loss of jobs, change of jobs. That we were, at least it sounded like we were assuming we're only talking about basically the 99%. We didn't talk about the jobs, the social space they occupy, or rethinking why we have this income and equality split that's only getting worse. I would think that would be a major future question.
Yeah, you always wonder what the meta issue is, the one that flies over the top of this. And I went to Carnegie Mellon to talk to some of the robotics students, the engineers, and I said, how often does your mom call to say, you'll never get a job, why don't you study something practical? And the answer is never. They'll be employed for life and make a ton of money. So they'll enter the 1%. But for many of others, our standards of living could sink. And you have this widening gap, which I used to say, well, it's going to cause social tension. I used to think that credit cards and easy credit before the Great Collapse is what stopped social unrest, because even though you didn't have what the 1%er had, you could use a credit card or a home equity loan to defer payment on something. And when that credit tightened up, tensions have increased, and we're seeing that play out in the election at some level. But absolutely, the income inequality question. So income inequality could be the meta issue. Education, I often think, is the meta issue, right? How about bigger or just under education? Campaign finance reform. Like, can you change education without sort of changing the political system? I can't answer that, but it's worth thinking. A last question from back here. There's a gentleman right here, and I'll tell a last story, and I'll let you go back to the World Series.
Bob's coming. Bob.
It's coming this way. Because Bob didn't need more exercise. Sir, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Bob. My name's Greg, and I think the question I have is around the notion of knowledge and the knowledge economy that we hear mentioned quite a bit, but also the potential loss of knowledge in the fact that in a digital age, bits rot. And so what happens with the notion of knowledge and the curation or organization of knowledge that enables at a fundamental level all of these other things that are going on, and that also helps us distinguish fact and objectivity and data from speculation.
Yeah, everyone entitled, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts stuff. And the great force of the last 30 years, disintermediation, in which the curators of this stuff, of the knowledge, have been shoved out of the way. And you think, well, that's awesome. We can look up whatever our medical ailment is online. I don't have to go to a doctor. But the problem is, some of us are not equipped to do some of this stuff, to read, someone just said. Certainly to think critically. And it has the potential of those with specialized knowledge that still requires curation, the engineers and others, are those who succeed. But it's possible that that as this information is democratized, that percolates out in a way that does lift up some people. It's a very interesting question about the future of knowledge. I'm working on maybe some coverage about an interesting project. You know how Obama likes to say, and I love it when he says the following, that talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. We have to deal with that. There's apparently, I have to do more research into this, a nonprofit, a charity, a philanthropy in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, that knows that math and engineering aptitude is distributed equally. And that in any village, there are those same kids who, if they had access to the teachers, would succeed. And you identify those people, the annoying ones in engineering class who do tests like that. They're everywhere. My neighbor in South Orange is from Ivory Coast, and is just this computer science genius, global, works on projects globally, was identified, not by a charity, but by in his own country. And you find those people, give them access to the actual information, and good things happen. Now remember I started out by saying there was this tension in the interview with Vonnegut? He was just so bleak on paper, yet he was delightful in person. He was telling some great jokes. Did you know that Kurt Vonnegut ran a Saab car dealership on Cape Cod for a while? He didn't have a lot of good things to say about the actual Saab cars, by the way, but I don't insult anybody. I always kind of liked them. I pressed him on this issue, and he said, he twisted it slightly, but he ended up answering the question, which was, what makes life worth living, given how awful things are? He says, to make life worth living, you have to join a gang. And I said, you gotta join a gang? What are you talking about? I live 3 blocks from one of the most intense inner cities anywhere. Don't say gang lightly. He said, no, a gang. You join gatherings of people who are chewing on these issues together. That kind of a gang. He was talking about social capital. He was talking about this kind of a gang. Thank you very much for being a gang.
Memorial Library, a great gang to belong to. I'm just saying.